I want to welcome everybody to this conversation, and it's a topical conversation because I became a fan of this conversation a few years back with our guest who's going to be joining us as someone who I see as a student of history who professes a love for history, and actually taught me, well, not so much taught me, but I guess refreshed my memory about our nation's birthday. And joining us for this conversation is none other than Plymouth County Sheriff Joe McDonald, and we are going to talk about Independence Day. We're not going to talk about the 4th of July. We'll get into that in just a moment. Sheriff, thank you for joining me for this conversation.
Kevin, thank you for having me.
You're, as I stated, you're a student of history. Why is that?
I have always been fascinated by our nation, our nation's past, world history even in general. I've just always been drawn to it, and I think, the key to whatever is going to happen next is what's already happened. And if you know history, you can't necessarily predict with precision, but you can predict trends. And I think history is the most important thing for us to know.
What's interesting is, as well, this conversation is not necessarily happening on 4th of July or when we all celebrate the 4th of July or Independence Day. But there's actually a misconception regarding our country's birthday and the dates. Kind of give us, if you will, the backstory on this.
Sure. Yeah, we have come to celebrate the 4th of July. And one thing a little editorial comment I'll make. When people say to me, Happy 4th of July, I accept that statement in the spirit in which it's offered, which is really not that today is the 4th day of July, that today is the anniversary of American independence. So I reply to those people. I don't correct them necessarily, but I like to say back to them, and a very happy Independence Day to you, because that is what it signifies. When this nation, our founding fathers, engaged in an act of treason, punishable by death, at the risk of their own lives, to declare that we were a country free and independent of the monarchy of Great Britain. And God bless them. I think we've done them proud, and I hope that we will continue to do so. But it's interesting to note, we celebrate the 4th of July, but the Second Continental Congress actually passed the resolution on the 2nd of July. So the vote for independence, the actual act of declaring independence, took place on July 2nd of 1776. It was a resolution known as the Lee Resolution that was offered by Richard Henry Lee of Virginia, and it passed almost unanimously. 12 of the 13 colonies voted in favor, or their delegates voted in favor of independence. The only colony that abstained was that of New York. They didn't vote against it, but they didn't have authority in their minds to vote for the resolution. So it's interesting to note that between July 2nd and July 4th, which we generally regard as the Independence Day, that would be the time that the document was prepared to be presented. It had to be calligraphied and made up and sent out to be signed. So that is the day, July 4th, that apparently the document itself was prepared and viewed by the members of the Second Continental Congress. So it's interesting to note that even our founding fathers did not view the 4th of July as the significant day. That's the date that appears in the document because it was written that day, but the resolution was July 2nd. And I just want to read to you a quote from one of the letters from John Adams, our second president, to Abigail Adams, his wife. And read those if you're a lover of history. They're collected in books. But listen to this. This is what John Adams had to say. The 2nd day of July, 1776, will be the most memorable epoch in the history of America. I am apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward, forevermore. Stated as only a founding father could, absolutely accurate up to the present time, just 2 days off.
You know, it's interesting, and again, I love your how your take on history, and you and I have a lot of conversations out of the ears and the eyes of other folks who are able to participate and be a part of what we're talking about. But you know, the July 4th, from what you have taught me, also has another. You mentioned one of the names, John Adams, but then there's another individual who's a part of it, another president, Thomas Jefferson, that July 4th also has a historical connotation to, correct?
Yes, yeah, and it's one of those ultimate ironies that many people don't realize. Adams was our second president, you know, George Washington being the first, but Thomas Jefferson was our third.
Right.
And during, Thomas Jefferson was actually the principal author of the Declaration of Independence and responsible for some beautiful, one of the most beautiful documents, I think, not just in American history, but in the history of the world. The two of them, for political reasons. Now, they had been friends during the founding days, but they became fierce political rivals over time. And, you know, we could do a whole show on just their rivalry. But beginning somewhere around 1810, 1812, they began to correspond with each other. They began to write letters back and forth. And I do know it's ironic that in those letters, both of them vowed that they would survive until the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And as fate and irony would have it, they both died on July the 4th, 1826, 50 years after American independence. And the really amazing thing, Thomas Jefferson passed away in the very early morning hours, and his last words were alleged to have been, "It is the 4th of July." And shortly thereafter, he refused any medication, and then shortly thereafter, he passed. Later in the day, July 4th, 1826, here in Massachusetts, John Adams passes away. And John Adams' last words are to me, very significant. Jefferson survives. It was amazing because they were hundreds of miles from each other in different states and still thinking and speaking of each other. But I think there is a depth to Adams' last words of Jefferson's survival that are extremely significant to me personally, and I think to our country.
Talk to me about the importance of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the very framework of our government, of our country, to be able to persevere and continue on for many decades.
You know, Kevin, it's amazing. I think, you know, in Adams' last words, Jefferson survives. What he meant wasn't necessarily that Jefferson the man, but Jefferson the ideas, those concepts of liberty and equality that made this country what it is today. And going forward, we're constantly improving on those things. But I think it's important to note that when we talk, and I used to do a little spiel about these types of things when I would speak at various places, but Massachusetts in general, and you know, we here in the Old Colony in Plymouth, we can honestly lay claim. They call Plymouth America's hometown. That is absolutely true. Here, when the Pilgrims landed in 1620, the first document of self-government is executed, the Mayflower Compact. You know, Massachusetts also has an Independence Day that most people don't know about. That would be October 7th of 1774. Under the Government Act, after the Boston Tea Party, martial law was declared, the Port of Boston was closed. Our legislature that we elected was dissolved, destroyed. Well, on October 7th, they reconstituted themselves and declared Massachusetts independent of the Crown of Great Britain. An amazing thing. So the birth of that is right here. And then you talk about the Constitution. It's an interesting thing to note that the Massachusetts Constitution predates the federal Constitution by 7 years, and Massachusetts Constitution is 1780. The Constitution of the United States didn't come into effect until 1789. And interesting to note that the Massachusetts Constitution was the model upon which the federal Constitution is based. So anyone that tells you that the oldest Constitution is that of the United States, wrong. The oldest Constitution is that of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
Does it seem like that's a common debate, or do you feel that the scholars understand and realize these facts?
I think scholars may realize it at the time, but it's easy to lose sight of these facts in the grand scheme, in the bigger picture, because we all know intuitively July 4th is when we celebrate independence, but that's, and you also have to remember too, the national scope, I think, is a little bit wider than ours. People would say as a historian, I'm very parochial, and maybe I am. I'm a little biased, but without Massachusetts and the things that we produced here, by way of ideas, there would not be any United States of America. And I'm very, very proud of our heritage and the role that our ancestors played, along with many, many others. Without the Virginians, Washington and Jefferson and Richard Henry Lee, who introduced the resolution. This country, we weren't founded by accident. We were founded by genius. And it amazes me to this moment in time that we got such brilliance in one place at one time, and this was the result.
So I would ask you, somebody who is, again, a student of history, I hope I'm saying that correctly, and I'm accurate with saying that. I think we're all students of something that we love, and we can never, there's an infinite love for learning about what it is that fascinates us. When it comes to the Declaration of Independence, other than the misconception of Independence Day and when it actually should be celebrated, are there any other unknown factoids that you'd like to share, or anything that maybe folks a lot of times forget as to the creation of not only the document, but of, setting forth our freedoms?
Well, Kevin, there are so many little vignettes we could share on various topics that, get lost in the shuffle. See, part of the problem, I think, is that our textbooks are written for a national audience. And I try to read a lot of history books, not just of a national variety, but also of the ones a little bit closer here to home. So there are so many things. And one of the things that, somebody commented to me once, geez, whenever we go someplace, you've always got something to talk about. And usually, almost without exception, what I'll talk about, oftentimes, even if I'm talking about contemporary things, I'll talk about history and how it is that we got there. And there's always something interesting to talk about, these factoids that people don't know. And I hope, people will be inspired by the things we're talking about to look into this a little bit, because it is so fascinating to sit here and think about, these two founding fathers who died on the same day, Adams in his 90s, Jefferson in his 80s, when normally people died in their 30s during this time in the 18th century. And, the significance of that comment, it's the 4th of July, and Jefferson survives. And he didn't, it's interesting, he didn't say Jefferson lives. They say that he said Jefferson survives. And to me, that's significant as well, because Jefferson, the idea, the democratic ideal that was Thomas Jefferson, it's amazing to me. And we are not just the benefactors, but we are the descendants of that tradition and the keepers of that tradition. Let's struggle to keep that alive.
Yeah, it's probably one of the last questions I'll ask you, as we get just a couple moments left with you. Again, we're speaking with Plymouth County Sheriff Joe McDonald, who's kind enough to have this conversation with me annually. And if I have anything to say about it, I'm going to continue having this conversation. If it's something that I can share with anybody, whether it's one person or 100 people or 2,000 people, we share the conversation and we better educate. How important is it, do you feel, that we continue to build on what our forefathers crafted back, a couple of 100 years ago? How important is it for us to continue building on that and improving it, whether it's the Declaration of Independence or our current Constitution, a living, breathing document?
Yeah, I think, I could say that it's vitally important, but I don't think I think that understates the importance of this. I would say that it's existentially important. In order for us to continue to exist, we need to, and not even necessarily build on those things, but refine those ideas. I suppose in some instances to build on them. But when you read the Declaration of Independence, you are struck by how perfect a document it is. And like so many things, it's more perfect on paper than it is in real life. And I think the important thing for us to do as government officials, as citizens, as anybody, as students of history, is to live up to those ideals that were so well expressed by individuals who themselves did not always live up to those ideals. So I think, all of the remedies to what we continue to improve and build upon, as you say, the constitutional living document. We amend it. It's amazing that they thought ahead to do those things. So I think the most important thing we can do is live our lives in a way that we don't always get to, but we try to live up to the ideals expressed in those documents.
Anything you want to say to wrap up this very segment in our conversation about Independence Day and our freedoms here in America?
Well, Kevin, I first want to thank you for remembering to give me a call. I didn't want to bother you, but I didn't know if you had interest in talking about these things any further. I'm glad you do. But I think it's important, and I've always impressed upon my own kids that, I became such a great fan of history for many reasons, one of which was I wasn't very good at math. But it was just such a fascinating story. And the answers to many of the problems that we face going forward have been dealt with effectively in the past. And I'm reminded of something that my grandfather used to say to me, which was that a smart person learns from his mistakes, but a really smart person learns from other people's mistakes. And I think if you look at history, it is replete with other people's mistakes. And to the extent that we can learn from them and do better, I'm happy.
Sheriff, thank you so much for your time. And
Kevin, I thank you.
You got it. And thank you for tuning into a program like this one. Hopefully you found it fun and educational. And from now on, when it comes to celebrating our nation's birthday, you'll refer to it more as Independence Day than 4th of July. Until next time, thank you for joining us here.